Lone Cowboy performed CPR on the Apache woman he saved from drowning, unaware of the consequences. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The Rio Grande ran swollen and dark from days of rain. The water churned heavy with mud, dragging whole branches along as if they were nothing. Colt Warren walked the bank in the fading light, a canvas sack of traps slung over his shoulder, the familiar weight pulling against his sore back. He had been setting lines since morning. It was his routine, the only thing that gave shape to days that otherwise felt empty. Colt was 39, tall and broad, his shoulders still carrying the build of a man used to ranch work, though he lived alone now. His face was weathered, sun creased around the eyes, his mustache streaked with gray that had come quicker since the loss of his wife and little boy 2 winters ago. He had taken to the cabin alone, away from town, because he couldn't stand the talk, the stares, or the sound of laughter from other families. He trapped, hunted, worked leather and iron when he had to, and rarely spoke more than a handful of words in a week. He crouched to the water's edge to check a steel trap tied to a stake, mud soaking into his knees. The jaws were empty, the bait washed clean by the current. He muttered under his breath, pulling it free. As he turned to move to the next, something dark caught his eye downstream, tangled in reeds against the rocks. At first he thought it was driftwood, another branch broken loose in the storm. He narrowed his eyes, straightening, and the breath stalled in his chest when he saw what it really was. An arm, small and lifeless, pale against the dark current. Colt dropped the sack in the mud. His heart pounded hard and his body moved on instinct, legs splashing into the water before he had time to think through what he was doing. The river tugged at him, cold and strong, soaking his trousers to the thigh. He grabbed at the figure, fingers locking around a wrist that felt too thin, skin cold and slick. He pulled, slipping on the rocks, gritting his teeth as the current fought to rip her back. He hauled with both arms until the body came free and he staggered backward onto the bank, falling to his knees in the mud with her across his lap. It was a young Apache woman, no older than 24. Her bronze skin was ashen, her lips blue. Her dress clung to her body, torn low across the chest, beads and tassels broken from the violence of water and whatever came before. She was still. Colt set 2 fingers against her neck, then leaned down to her chest. Nothing. His stomach clenched. He had not touched another woman since his wife had died. The thought of it made his hands hesitate, just for a second. But the sight of her stillness, the sound of the river around them, left no space for hesitation. He pressed the heel of his hand hard against her sternum, his calloused palms pumping in steady rhythm, every push counting against the silence in his head. "Come on," he muttered, his voice rough and low. He leaned down, sealed his mouth over hers, and gave a breath. Her lips were cold, the taste of river water sharp. He pulled back, pushed again on her chest, and gave another breath. The weight of years of loneliness pressed down on him in that moment. If she slipped away, she would be one more life lost before his eyes, another face he could not save. He shoved the thought down and kept going, jaw clenched, water dripping from his mustache. Finally, her chest heaved under his hands. She coughed hard, choking, water spilling from her lips. The sound tore through the roar of the river. Colt rolled her to the side, steadying her with one arm. She gagged, her body convulsing, then dragged in a rasping breath. Her eyes opened, dark and wild, staring up at him with confusion and fear. For a moment, she struggled weakly against him, as if he were another threat. Colt pulled his coat free and wrapped it around her shoulders, holding her just firm enough to keep her from slipping back into the mud. "You're all right," he said, voice quieter now, though he wasn't sure if she understood the words. She coughed again, clutching at the coat, her hands trembling. Her gaze darted from his face to the woods, to the river, as if she expected someone else to appear. Colt noticed bruises at her collarbone, raw rope marks at her wrists. His jaw tightened. She hadn't just been taken by the river. He shifted, lifting her into his arms. She was light, far too light, her head resting against his chest as her breath came shallow and ragged. He pushed himself up, boots digging into the mud as he climbed the bank. His cabin sat on a rise above the river, a half-mile walk through soaked ground. Every step was heavy with her weight, though it wasn't the burden of her body that pressed on him, but the sudden fact of her presence. Another living soul in his arms, someone broken, someone who needed him. Inside, the cabin was dim, the fire in the hearth nearly gone. He kicked the door shut with his boot and carried her to the bed, the one he hadn't used since burying his wife. He set her down carefully, then crouched by the fire, throwing on wood until the flames rose. The light spread across the room, washing over her wet skin, the torn fabric of her dress, the way her eyes watched him from the blanket he pulled over her. She said nothing, only coughed and pulled the coat tighter around herself. Colt sat heavy on the stool by the fire, his breathing rough. He rubbed his hands across his face, water dripping from his hair, his mind racing. He hadn't planned for this. He didn't invite anyone into his life anymore, not since he had lost everything that mattered. And yet here she was, pulled from the river, breathing because he refused to let her die. For a long time, the only sound in the cabin was the crack of the fire and her shallow breaths. Colt stared into the flames, his hands shaking once before he stilled them against his knees. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew one thing with certainty. He had taken responsibility the moment he pressed his mouth to hers and gave her life back. And there would be no turning away from that now. The fire had built up strong again, casting steady light against the cabin walls. But the warmth did little to settle Colt Warren's nerves. He sat forward on the stool with his elbows on his knees, watching the woman he had dragged from the river. She lay still on his bed, her breathing shallow but regular now, her wet hair fanned out across the blanket, her lips pale, though no longer blue. Her eyes were half closed, though he could tell she wasn't sleeping. She was watching him in quick glances, darting away whenever he caught her gaze, the way an animal tested the distance to a trap. He shifted, rubbing at the back of his neck, trying to push the knot of tension out. He wasn't used to another presence here. For nearly 3 years, since his wife and boy had been buried, no one else had stepped past the threshold. He had chosen it that way. Now, with her here, he could feel the weight of every decision pressing closer. Who was she? Why was she alone at the river in this storm? And what danger followed her that he hadn't yet seen? She coughed hard, curling against herself under the blanket, and Colt reached for the kettle hanging over the fire. He poured hot water into a tin cup, dipped a clean rag, and brought it over. He crouched beside her, his big frame blocking the firelight. "Here," he said, keeping his voice low. She stiffened as he held out the cup, her dark eyes flicking from his face to his hands. For a moment, he thought she wouldn't take it, that fear would outweigh need. But her trembling fingers reached slowly, brushing against his calloused knuckles as she took the tin. She lifted it to her lips and drank, spilling a little down her chin. Colt steadied the cup, his hand beneath hers, then pulled back once she drank enough to wet her throat. "Easy," he muttered. She looked at him then, long enough for him to see more than fear. Exhaustion, distrust, something deeper too, as if she had been running from more than the river. When she lowered the cup, she whispered a word in Apache, voice cracked and uneven. He couldn't understand most of it, but he caught enough. Men, ropes, escape. He frowned, jaw tightening, eyes falling to the bruises at her collarbone and the raw rope burns around her wrists. He didn't ask more. He didn't press her. What mattered was clear enough. Someone had done this to her. Someone might come looking. And he had pulled her into his cabin without thinking about what that meant. Colt stood, turned back to the fire, and set the cup down. His mind ran in circles. The cabin was remote, but riders sometimes passed the ridge, traitors or worse. If anyone was hunting her, they'd search every hollow until they found her trail. He looked back to the bed. She had pulled the blanket higher, her small frame shaking with cold. She looked fragile, almost too weak to lift herself upright, yet there was a sharpness in her gaze that told him she was not broken. He drew a chair closer to the bed and sat heavy, leaning back. His body ached from the pull at the river, but his thoughts wouldn't settle. He remembered the feel of her chest under his palms, the desperate pressure of his mouth against hers, the panic of trying to force air back into her lungs. He had acted without thought, and now every detail of that moment stayed with him. She was alive because of him. That bound them together in a way he hadn't expected, and in a way he couldn't easily undo. She stirred then, shifting beneath the blanket, her eyes glinting in the firelight. She said something else, softer this time, the words broken, but he caught one name. He hesitated, then spoke, his voice gravelly. Colt. Colt Warren. He tapped his chest once, slow, making it clear. Her lips parted, repeating the sound faintly, struggling with a foreign shape. She coughed, then whispered something in return, a name he couldn't quite catch through the rasp, though he held on to it as best he could. The silence stretched. Outside, the river still roared, wind pushing against the cabin walls, but inside the firelight held them in a fragile pocket of calm. Colt leaned forward, forearms resting on his thighs, watching her fight to stay awake. His thoughts tangled, whether to ride into town, come morning for supplies, whether to keep her presence hidden, whether it was even safe to let her stay here. But as he watched her, her chest rising slow and steady under the blanket, he knew he wasn't going to send her back into the storm. He pulled another blanket from the chest at the foot of the bed and draped it over her, careful not to touch more than he had to. She stirred, her fingers brushing his wrist briefly, not in fear this time, but in something closer to trust. He froze, then eased his hand back. Her eyes closed at last, her breath evening out as she slipped into a restless sleep. Colt sat in the chair long into the night, staring into the fire, his rifle propped against the wall within reach. Every sound outside made him tense, waiting for riders or voices that never came. He told himself he had only saved a life, nothing more, but in his gut he knew the truth. By pulling her from the river and carrying her into his home, he had crossed a line. Their fates were tied now, whether he liked it or not, and he would have to live with what came next. The morning came gray and cold, with mist rising off the river and seeping through the gaps in the cabin walls. Colt Warren had not slept more than a few minutes through the night. He sat slouched in the chair by the bed, his rifle leaning against the wall, boots still on. His eyes were gritty and heavy, but every time he closed them, he heard the river again, the frantic pounding of his palms against her chest, the desperate gasp when she came back. It stayed with him, sharper than any nightmare. She stirred with the first light, coughing into the blanket, her breathing rough but stronger than it had been the night before. Colt straightened, rubbing the ache from his neck. Her eyes blinked open slowly, dark and unfocused at first, then sharpening as they fixed on him. There was fear again, the same as before, but it wasn't wild panic. It was something quieter, edged with caution, like she was trying to decide if he was enemy or not. Colt reached for the kettle on the hearth and poured warm water into the tin cup, setting it on the small table near her. "Drink," he said, voice rough from hours of silence. He gestured toward it, making the meaning plain. She pushed herself up on one elbow, trembling, the blanket slipping slightly to reveal her bruised collarbone. Her fingers shook as she reached, and Colt held the cup steady until she managed a sip. Her lips parted, and she whispered a word, broken English this time, the sound soft and uneven. "Thanks." He gave a short nod. Hearing her speak in English caught him off guard. The night before, her words had been mostly in Apache, scattered phrases. Now it was clearer, though still hesitant. He studied her more closely, realizing she might understand more than he assumed. "What happened?" His voice was low, careful. He didn't expect a full answer, but he asked anyway. Her eyes dropped to the blanket clutched at her chest. For a long moment she said nothing, just breathed unevenly. Then she lifted her wrist and showed him the raw rope burns, skin torn and red. "Men," she whispered, "took me." She struggled with the words, piecing them together. "Escape. River." Colt's jaw tightened. It was what he suspected, but hearing it in her broken voice hardened something in his chest. He thought of the riders that sometimes passed through, traders or drifters who didn't care who they hurt. He thought of how far she must have come to end up in the river half dead. And he thought of the bruises he had seen under her torn dress, the fear in her eyes, even now. "Anybody looking for you?" he asked. She shook her head at first, then paused, uncertainty flickering across her face. "Maybe," she admitted, almost too quiet to hear. Her gaze darted to the window as if she expected someone to ride past. Colt sat back in a chair, silent. He didn't press her with more questions. She had told him enough for now. What mattered was that she had been taken, abused, and left for dead, and someone out there might still want her back. That meant danger, for her and for him. He had always kept his distance from people to avoid trouble. But trouble had walked into his cabin anyway, carried in his own arms. She pulled the blanket higher, her eyes closing briefly. When they opened again, she looked at him as if weighing something. Her lips moved carefully. "Name." "Colt." She remembered what he had told her in the night. He gave a single nod. "Colt." Then she touched her chest, pressing her palm there. "Nayeli." The sound was clearer this time, her name spoken firm despite the rasp in her throat. Colt repeated it under his breath, making sure he got it right. "Nayeli." She nodded once, satisfied. For the first time, he thought he saw a flicker of relief in her expression, small but real. The morning stretched on. He set bread and a strip of dried venison on the table and stepped back. Nayeli reached for it slowly, her hands still trembling, but hunger overpowered hesitation. She ate in silence, eyes lowering whenever she felt his watching her. Colt didn't look away. He took in the bruises, the way her dress clung in tatters, the curve of her shoulders fragile, yet holding onto strength. He found himself wondering questions he hadn't asked the night before, questions the listeners to this story might have asked too. Why was she near the river at all? Why had she been taken? And what dangers still followed her here? He didn't have the answers yet, but one thing was certain. She was not safe on her own, not with men like the one she described roaming the land. When she finished eating, Colt stood and moved to the door, opening it to scan the ridge. The morning was still, mist rolling off the river, no riders in sight. He let the door fall shut and turned back to her. She was sitting upright now, wrapped in the blanket, watching him with guarded eyes. He took his seat again, elbows on his knees, voice steady. "You can stay. For now." He didn't know what else to say, but it was the truth. He wouldn't turn her out into the cold, not after pulling her from death itself. Nayeli's gaze held his for a long second, then she nodded faintly. Her body sagged, not in weakness, but in a way that looked like relief. For the first time since he'd found her, she closed her eyes without fear, resting back against the pillow, trusting, if only for this moment, that she would wake alive again. Colt stayed in the chair, watching the fire crackle, his mind running. She was here now. Whatever came of it, he had made his choice the moment he pressed his breath into her lungs. And choices like that carried weight. By the second day, the storm had broken, leaving the air clear and sharp, but the ground outside was heavy with mud. Colt Warren stepped out early to check the line of traps he hadn't been able to reach the night before. The river ran lower now, though still strong, its surface carrying bits of broken branch and the occasional bloated carcass of a deer swept downstream. Colt worked methodically, resetting iron jaws, baiting what needed baiting, his thoughts running back to the cabin with every quiet step. He hadn't left another person in his home since his family's passing. The knowledge pressed heavy on his chest. When he returned, she'd still be there. When he pushed the cabin door open, the fire had died to embers. Nayeli was awake this time, sitting upright with the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. Her eyes met his immediately, watchful but not frantic. She had found the water bucket and was sipping from the dipper. The faintest trace of color had returned to her face. Colt set his rifle aside and moved to build the fire again, the sound of flint striking echoing in the quiet room. She watched him closely, as if trying to measure the man who had carried her back from the river. "Food," Colt said flatly, setting a small plate of cornbread and salted meat on the table. She hesitated, then rose from the bed slowly, her legs unsteady under her weight. The blanket slipped lower, showing more of the bruises across her chest and shoulder. She pulled it tighter again quickly, but not before Colt noticed the depth of the marks. They weren't from the river alone. His jaw clenched, But he kept his silence, not wanting to press questions she wasn't ready to answer. She ate slowly, tearing the bread in small pieces, her eyes darting to him each time he moved. When she was finished, she leaned back against the wall, exhausted from the simple act of standing. Colt took the plate, set it aside, then busied himself mending tack at the workbench. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackle of fire. After a time, she spoke again, her English clearer than the night before. "You alone?" The question made him pause. He looked at her, then gave a slow nod. "Yes, alone." His voice was steady, though the truth of the word burned in his chest. He wondered if she sensed it, the grief buried in his answer. She lowered her eyes, but did not push further. Her fingers traced the edge of the blanket, her mind clearly turning over thoughts of her own. She shifted once, as if to ask more, then stopped, her lips pressed tight. Colt went back to his work, though his ears stayed open. He knew the listeners, like he himself, might wonder who she was running from, whether her family knew she was alive, or if she had anyone left at all. She gave no answers yet, but her silence carried enough weight to suggest the truth wasn't simple. Later, when the sun dropped lower, Colt went to bring in wood. He returned to find her crouched near the fire, poking at the embers with a stick. She looked up quickly, startled, then shifted back as if she had been caught stealing. Colt set the wood down and said simply, "Good. Keep it lit." He didn't smile, but there was no sharpness in his tone. She blinked, then nodded, settling again by the hearth. She tried to stand later, carrying a bucket toward the door. Her steps faltered and the bucket spilled half its water onto the floor. Colt caught her by the elbow before she could fall. Her body stiffened at his touch, but she didn't jerk away. He steadied her, his hand firm but careful, then set the bucket aside. For a moment they stood close, her breath shallow, her eyes meeting his with a tension that wasn't only fear. Colt stepped back, releasing her gently. "Rest," he said. She hesitated, then whispered, "I help." "You will," he answered. "When you can." The words seemed to ease something in her. She returned to the bed, not in defeat, but in understanding. For now, he would carry the weight. That night, Colt sat by the fire, sharpening his knife while she lay wrapped in the blanket. The cabin felt different now. No longer hollow, but filled with another's breathing, another presence. He wondered how long it would last, whether danger still followed her trail, and whether he was ready to face whatever came. He thought again of the moment at the river, his mouth pressed to hers, the heat of her chest under his palms. He had saved her. That bound them. And no matter how much his grief told him to keep distant, his gut told him he wouldn't let her go back to the cold world outside. As the fire burned low, she whispered something in Apache, words he couldn't understand, her voice soft but certain. He didn't need to know the language to hear what was in it. Relief, gratitude, maybe the first thin thread of trust. He sat quiet, listening, until her voice faded and her breathing evened out. Only then did he lean back, staring into the flames, knowing that whatever lay ahead, the silence of his cabin had ended. The next morning brought a pale sun that cut through the mist and sent weak light spilling across the valley. Colt Warren rose early, the stiffness in his shoulders reminding him he had spent another night half sleeping in a chair. He went about his usual routine, feeding the fire, boiling water, slicing dried venison, though nothing felt usual anymore. Every sound he made seemed louder in the cabin with another person listening, even if she made no move to speak. Nayeli stirred not long after, pushing herself upright with more strength than the day before. She clutched the blanket tight around her chest, her eyes following Colt as he moved between the table and the hearth. There was a faint steadiness in her breathing now, her lips less pale. Colt placed a tin plate with bread and meat on the table and gestured for her to eat. She stood, slower than he would have liked, but she crossed the space on her own and sat at the table. It was the first time she had done so since he brought her in. As she ate, Colt found his eyes drawn again and again to the bruises that stretched across her collarbone and shoulders, marks that told more of her story than she had yet shared. He wondered who the men were, how far they might ride to search for her, and whether they'd come near his cabin. He knew listeners of this story might ask the same. Who had taken her? Why? And what did she mean when she said escape the night before? But Naeli offered no more detail, only silence as she ate, her shoulders stiff as if the memory still pressed down hard. Colt did not force words from her. He had lived long enough to know some truths came only in time. When she finished, she tried to rise and gather the plate herself. Her hands shook, but she carried it to the basin, splashing water over the tin. Colt started to move forward, instinct to stop her, but he held himself back. She needed to feel she could stand on her own. Still, when her arm faltered, he stepped close and steadied the plate with one hand. Their eyes met for a moment, close enough for him to see the tension there, and something else beneath it, stubbornness. She was determined not to be only a burden. Later, she pulled the blanket tighter and went to the chest where he kept sewing needles and thread. She found one of his shirts in a pile, the sleeve torn from a fence post days ago. With slow, careful motions, she began to mend it. Her stitches were uneven at first, her fingers trembling, but she persisted. Colt watched from the bench, his hands still on the leather strap he had been cutting, his gaze lingering on her bent head, the dark braids slipping over her shoulder. It stirred something in him he hadn't felt in years. The sight of someone filling the silence of his cabin with more than chores, with small signs of life. By midday, she ventured outside. Colt walked behind, rifle resting against his shoulder, scanning the tree line. The air smelled damp and sharp, the earth soft underfoot. She bent to gather wood near the cabin, her bare feet sinking into the mud. The blanket slipped now and then, exposing the torn neckline of her dress, the bruises fading to yellow and purple. She didn't seem to notice, but Colt's eyes caught and turned away each time, his jaw tightening. Desire and concern clashed inside him, and he busied his hands with stacking the wood she brought. When she stumbled once on the uneven ground, Colt caught her by the arm before she fell. She froze at his touch but didn't pull away. For a moment, they stayed like that, his hand firm around her elbow, her body leaning against his for balance. Her breathing slowed, her eyes rising to his. The contact was brief, but it carried a weight that neither spoke of. He let go gently, stepping back, giving her space. That evening, the cabin smelled of boiled broth and wood smoke. Naeli sat by the fire, wrapped in the blanket, sewing again. Colt sat across from her, sharpening his knife, watching her hands move steady now. The firelight flickered across her face, softening the sharp angles left by hunger and fear. She looked up once, catching him watching, and for the first time she didn't look away immediately. Instead, she held his gaze a heartbeat longer before lowering her eyes. Colt's thoughts turned restless as the night deepened. He wondered if he should take her into town, though the idea of leaving her in others' hands felt wrong in his gut. He knew the questions outsiders would ask, the judgment they would pass, and how little they'd care about the truth. He told himself he would decide later, when she was stronger. For now, she was here, alive, and he would not let her be taken again. Before sleep, Naeli whispered something, quiet, uncertain, but clear enough. "Thank you." The words carried both gratitude and a trace of vulnerability. Colt sat still, his chest heavy, and gave a single nod. He didn't trust his voice not to break if he tried to answer. The fire burned low, and the cabin fell quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. It wasn't the silence of grief. It was the silence of two people holding their own thoughts, side by side, with the faintest thread of trust binding them closer than either had expected. The following days brought clearer skies. The last of the storm washed out to the horizon. The ground was still damp, soft under boots, but the air held warmth for the first time in weeks. Colt Warren stepped outside at dawn, rifle slung, eyes scanning the ridge before heading toward the traps. He moved slower than usual, his attention split. He wasn't used to leaving someone behind in the cabin, and the thought of Naeli there alone unsettled him more than he expected. When he returned, smoke curled faintly from the chimney. He pushed the door open and found her crouched near the hearth, feeding the fire. She had pulled her wet dress from the night of the river down to the last intact layers, leaving the neckline uneven and ragged, but she covered herself with his coat draped over her shoulders. She glanced up quickly when he entered, her eyes sharp with awareness, but not panic. Colt felt something shift in his chest at that look. It wasn't fear anymore. It was recognition. She rose carefully, still unsteady but determined, and moved toward the table. A bucket sat nearby, half filled with water she had hauled herself. Colt frowned at the sight of it. She must have gone to the stream alone while he was gone. "You don't," he said firmly, stepping toward her. She paused, clutching the coat tighter, then shook her head once, the defiance clear. "Help," she answered. Her voice was soft but steady, her English improving each day. He exhaled through his nose, fighting back the urge to argue. She wanted to claim her place here, not as a burden, but as someone who contributed. He understood that need too well. Over the next hours, they moved in a rhythm neither had spoken aloud. She swept the floor in slow, deliberate strokes, pausing often to catch her breath. He split it outside, stacking it against the wall. At midday, he returned to find her stitching the tear in her dress with uneven but determined hands. The neckline still gaped, but her fingers worked as if the act itself gave her strength. Colt lingered in the doorway longer than he meant to, his eyes drawn to the curve of her shoulders, the line of her throat as she bent over the cloth. She looked up suddenly, catching him watching. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then she lowered her eyes and continued, but not with the same guarded tension as before. That evening, the silence between them carried a different weight. They ate together at the table for the first time. She sat across from him, her dark eyes studying him openly while he chewed in his usual, deliberate way. After a long pause, she asked, "Why alone?" The question struck deeper than he expected. He set his fork down, jaw tightening. "My wife," he said slowly, his voice thick. "My boy, fever, took them." He looked down at his hands, broad and scarred, turning the knife idly in his grip. "Since then, I stay alone." He hadn't spoken those words aloud in years. The cabin seemed to hold the weight of them, the fire popping once in the silence that followed. Naeli's eyes softened. She nodded slowly, her lips pressing tight as if she understood more than words aloud. She didn't offer pity, and Colt was grateful for that. Instead, she reached across the table, her fingers brushing lightly against his wrist. The touch was brief but intentional. His breath caught in his chest, the warmth of her hand stirring something buried under years of cold. Later, as the fire burned low, she moved closer on the bench near the hearth. Her shoulder brushed against his arm, not by accident. She didn't pull away. He stayed still, his body tense at first, then easing as the quiet pressed in around them. He turned slightly, close enough to see the firelight catch in her hair, close enough to feel the warmth of her through the coat. She looked up at him, eyes searching. He leaned in without thinking, closing the distance slowly. Their lips met in a soft, hesitant kiss, her hand rising to rest against his chest. His heartbeat thundered under her touch. When he pulled back, his breath was uneven, his gaze steady on hers. She didn't flinch. Instead, she whispered his name, low and sure. Colt. Hearing it from her lips sent a weight through him he couldn't explain. He nodded once, pressing his forehead lightly against hers before drawing back. That night, she lay wrapped in his coat near the fire while he sat nearby, knife in hand but forgotten on his knee. He kept his eyes on her as sleep pulled her under, the lines of fear on her face easing for the first time since the river. He realized then what listeners might have wondered all along. If she trusted him enough to stay, if he trusted himself enough to let her in. The answer had already been given in the kiss, in the way she whispered his name. Colt leaned back in the chair, the firelight flickering across his weathered face, and allowed himself to admit the truth. His cabin was no longer a place of silence. It was changing because of her, and whether the world outside approved or not, he wasn't going to let her go. The days that followed carried a rhythm neither of them had expected. The cabin, once filled only with Colt Warren silence and the routine of survival, now carried the sound of a second breath, a second pair of hands moving through the daily work. The storm had broken for good, the skies clearing, and the ground drying under a pale spring sun. With the change in weather came the demand for harder chores, fences to mend, wood to stack, traps to check. And Naeli, though still healing, refused to remain idle. On the seventh morning since he had pulled her from the river, Colt opened the cabin door to find her already outside, crouched near the woodpile, dragging pieces one at a time toward the wall. She was wrapped still in his coat, her torn dress beneath it clinging loose and ragged, but her movements were stronger. She looked up at him when she noticed him watching, her dark eyes steady, and for the first time she didn't shrink from his gaze. "Help," she said firmly, almost as if to challenge him to deny her. Colt set his jaw, stepping into the yard with a rifle in hand, scanning the ridge before he gave a nod. "Stay close," he said, his voice low, carrying more weight than the two words might suggest. The listeners to this story might have wondered by now if she truly belonged to anyone, if her tribe or kin would come searching, or if the men who had tied her wrists and left those bruises were still hunting her trail. These were questions Colt himself carried heavy in his thoughts, questions he asked only in silence. Naeli never spoke names, never described faces, only men in that broken English, her voice going tight as if the memory was a chain she refused to touch. Colt didn't push. What mattered was that someone had meant harm, and that harm had nearly ended her in the river. Together they set to work through the day. He showed her where the fence line had broken in the last flood, the posts leaning with the push of water. She lifted a rail with him, her small hands gripping firm despite the tremor in her arms. Colt carried most of the weight, but he didn't stop her from trying. When her knees buckled, he caught her under the elbow, steadying her as he had before. Her body leaned against his for balance, and though she stiffened, she didn't pull away. He felt her warmth even through the coat, and when she looked up, her eyes held as a moment too long before she glanced back to the ground. By afternoon, she was worn thin, her body telling the truth her pride wanted to ignore. Colt led her back inside, his hand at her back, guiding her through the door. She sank onto the bench by the fire without protest, pulling the coat tighter around her. Colt brought a tin of water, crouched beside her, and pressed it into her hands. She drank slow, her breath shaking. He studied her face in the firelight, the faint marks of exhaustion, the scars on her wrists healing into dark lines, the quiet resilience that had kept her alive through everything that had come before. "You'll break yourself," Colt said finally, his voice softer than he meant. Naeli shook her head, setting the cup aside. "No," she whispered. "I stay strong." The words were halting, but the meaning was clear. She would not go back to being powerless. Colt looked at her for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. He understood. That night, the bond between them deepened in ways neither had planned. After supper, when the dishes were set aside, she sat near him by the fire. She no longer kept distance. Her shoulder brushed his arm lightly. He didn't move away. The silence stretched, comfortable this time, not heavy. Then she lifted her hand, laying it gently against the back of his, her fingers curling slightly. Colt froze, every muscle tense, then turned his hand over to take hers. Her palm was small against his, the rope scars rough against his calloused skin. He squeezed lightly, careful, and she squeezed back. The kiss they had shared days earlier returned to his thoughts, and he wondered if she thought of it too. When she leaned her head against his shoulder, her hair brushing his neck, he knew she did. His chest tightened, but not with the old grief that had lived there for so long. This was something different, new, fragile, but alive. He bent his head slightly, pressing his lips against the crown of her hair. She closed her eyes, breathing deep, and for a moment, the cabin felt like a place of peace again. But peace on the frontier was never simple. Near midnight, Colt woke at the faint sound of hooves carrying through the valley. He moved quiet, slipping from the chair, rifle in hand. Through the crack of the door, he saw shapes against the ridge, two riders, moving slow, their voices faint in the stillness. He couldn't make out words, but the sound of them was enough. He watched until they disappeared into the dark, then shut the door soft and turned back. Naeli was awake, sitting upright in the bed, her eyes wide and fixed on him. She had her too. He moved closer, crouching beside her. Men, he said simply. She nodded, her breath shaking. For a moment, she clutched at the blanket, her knuckles white. Then she whispered something sharp in Apache, words filled with fear. Colt caught only one repeated word, find. He laid a hand lightly on her arm. They won't, he said, steady, certain, though part of him knew it was a promise he couldn't make absolute. But it was enough for her in that moment. She leaned into him, trembling, and his arm went around her shoulders. Her face pressed against his chest, her breath warm against him. He held her there until her shaking eased. By dawn, the riders were gone, the valley quiet again, but the weight of danger hung over them both. Colt set his rifle near the door, closer than before, and his eyes lingered on the ridge every time he stepped outside. He knew the listeners might wonder, were those men the same who had taken her? Did they know she had survived the river? And would they come back to search closer? Colt didn't have the answers, but he knew one thing. He would not hand her over. As the sun rose, she moved from the bed and joined him at the table. She looked worn but resolute. Her eyes locked on his, and she spoke with deliberate care, her English broken but strong. I stay. With you. Colt felt the words strike deep. He gave a short nod, the tightness in his throat holding back anything more. It was a choice spoken aloud. She had survived the river, survived the men who tried to take her, and now she chose to remain here. With him, the silence that followed wasn't hollow. It was full, alive, binding them both in a way stronger than words could carry. For the first time in years, Colt Warren allowed himself to believe that maybe he was not meant to walk the rest of his days alone. And that belief carried a weight heavier than grief, but far more worth bearing. The morning after the riders passed, Colt Warren's cabin felt less like a place of refuge and more like a target. He rose before first light, shouldering his rifle and walking the ridge, eyes scanning the valley with deliberate care. The ground was damp, the grass pressed flat in places that spoke of hooves. Whoever had come through hadn't lingered long, but the evidence was there. Colt crouched near a patch of soft earth, pressing his palm to the tracks. Two horses, moving slow, searching, not traders, not men passing through on their way to town. They had been looking for something, or someone. By the time he returned to the cabin, Nayeli was already awake, wrapped in his coat, crouched near the fire. She had been listening for him, he realized, because her eyes went directly to the door when he stepped inside. She studied his face the way someone judged weather in the sky, looking for signs of danger he might not speak. They were close, Colt said plainly, setting the rifle against the wall. Nayeli's lips pressed tight. She lowered her eyes, but didn't ask questions. Her silence was telling enough. He had wondered since the beginning who the men were, what they had wanted with her, and why she had risked the river to escape. The listeners of this story might have carried the same questions, but Colt saw the answer in her face before she spoke it. She had run because the alternative was worse than drowning. They take me, she said, her voice rough, each word dragged from her throat as if painful to form. Far. Sell. She stopped there, her eyes flicking up to his, wide and unflinching now. She didn't need to say more. Colt felt his chest tighten, his jaw harden. He had suspected as much, but hearing it laid bare left a fire in his gut. You're not going back, he said firmly. Her eyes stayed on him a long moment. Then she nodded, the faintest tremor running through her body. That day, he kept her close. When he worked outside, she followed, carrying what her strength allowed. She gathered wood while he split it, stacked stones while he reset the fence line. Once, when a hawk's shadow passed overhead, she flinched so sharply she dropped the bundle in her arms. Colt moved to her side immediately, steadying her with a hand at her back. She looked up at him, her breath shallow, her eyes searching his face for something he hadn't yet promised, but already felt deep, safety. By evening, they returned to the cabin exhausted, but the work had carved something steady between them. Inside, the fire burned bright, and the air smelled of stew he had left simmering. Nayeli sat at the table, her hair loose over her shoulders, while Colt set bowls in front of them both. They ate in silence at first, but it was no longer the silence of strangers. It was the quiet of two people carrying the same burden, even if they didn't name it aloud. Afterward, she sat near the fire, sewing again, her fingers steady now. Colt took his usual chair, knife in hand, though his eyes lingered on her more than his work. When she shifted, the coat slipped from her shoulder, revealing the curve of her collarbone, the fading bruises beneath. He caught himself staring too long, heat rising in his chest, and forced his gaze back to the blade. But when he looked again, she was watching him. She didn't pull the coat higher. The air between them thickened, unspoken questions rising. Was she safe here with him? Could he resist the pull of desire when grief still lived inside him? And did she want more than the shelter he gave? Listeners might wonder too, but the truth was written in their eyes long before either acted. She rose from the hearth and crossed the room, her steps slow but steady. Colt's breath hitched when she stopped before him, her hand lowering to rest lightly on his shoulder. He set the knife aside, his hands falling open on his knees. She leaned closer, her hair brushing against his face, her eyes locking with his. For a moment, he stayed still, wrestling with the weight of choice, whether to push her back, to keep the wall of distance, or to accept what both of them already knew had begun. He lifted a hand, rough palm, cupping her cheek, thumb brushing along her skin. She didn't flinch. Her lips parted, and he kissed her, slow, deliberate, with a care that bordered on reverence. Her hand moved to his chest, fingers curling in the fabric of his shirt, and he felt the warmth of her body press against him. The kiss deepened, steady, carrying not only desire but the relief of survival, the shared truth that neither was alone anymore. When they pulled apart, Naeli whispered his name. Cole. Her voice was soft, certain. He rested his forehead against hers, his hand sliding to the back of her neck. You're safe here, he said. It was not a boast, not a promise made lightly. It was the truth as far as his strength could carry it. That night, she didn't take the bed alone. She lay beside him, the firelight casting shadows across the walls, her head resting against his chest. His arm wrapped around her, holding her with a steadiness he hadn't given anyone in years. They did not speak further. Words weren't needed. The cabin that had once been a tomb of grief was now filled with the warmth of two bodies choosing to stay together. Yet danger still pressed at the edges. Colt knew the riders would come again, searching harder, riding closer. But as he listened to Naeli's breathing slow against him, he felt the resolve harden in his chest. He had pulled her from the river, given her life back, and now that life was bound to his. Whatever consequences came, he would not let her be taken again. For the first time since burying his family, Colt closed his eyes with someone beside him, and sleep came without the weight of loneliness. The fire burned low, steady, the sound of her breath mixing with his in the quiet cabin, a promise unspoken but certain. They would face what came together. The morning after she first lay beside him, the cabin no longer felt like the hollow place it had been for years. Colt Warren rose early, as he always did, but when he stood from the bed, Naeli stirred and reached for him, her hand brushing his arm. The touch was small, yet it carried a weight he could not ignore. He lingered a moment, watching her eyes open slowly, the firelight from the hearth soft across her face. For the first time, he saw her without the haze of fear that had clung since the river. She was tired, yes, but alive, steady, and hers was no longer the look of someone waiting for death. Still, Colt's instincts kept him on edge. He stepped out into the pale morning, rifle slung, eyes scanning the ridge. The riders who had passed before might return, and he knew better than to hope danger would simply move on. The tracks had been fresh. Men who searched once would likely search again. When he returned, Naeli was up, wrapped in his coat, trying to sweep the dirt from the cabin floor. She looked up sharply at the sound of the door, relief flashing in her eyes when she saw it was only him. He set his rifle aside, watching her for a moment. You don't need to push yourself, he said. Her chin lifted, stubbornness plain. I stay. I help. Her English was broken but firm. She wasn't going to sit idle and wait for safety to be given. She wanted to claim her place here. Colt respected it, even if part of him wished she'd rest longer. He gave a short nod, letting her continue. As the day passed, they worked side by side, hauling water, checking the traps, mending the small breaks in the fence. Naeli moved slower, but her determination held. At one point, she tried to lift a log too heavy for her arms. Colt stepped in quickly, taking the weight from her hands. She bristled, ready to argue, but when his eyes met hers, the fight left her. Together, she said instead, her voice softer. He nodded, the single word carrying more truth than anything else that day. That evening, as they shared stew at the table, the sound of hooves reached them again. Both froze. Colt set his spoon down, his hand moving automatically for the rifle leaning against the wall. Naeli's hand trembled, but she didn't cry out. Instead, she looked at him, her eyes steady, waiting for his lead. Colt rose and moved to the window, keeping low. Through the thin crack in the shutters, he saw them. 3 men this time, riding slow along the ridge, scanning the land below. "They're looking," Colt muttered. Naeli's breath caught, her hand tightening on the edge of the table. She whispered something in Apache, a single sharp word that carried all the fear she still held. Colt turned back to her, his voice low but firm. "They won't take you." It was a promise he spoke without hesitation, even though he knew the cost it might carry. The men circled lower, their voices drifting faint in the air. Colt stepped outside, rifle in hand, planting himself in the open. The riders noticed him quickly, their horses slowing as they came closer. One of them, tall with a broad hat pulled low, raised a hand in greeting that carried no friendliness. "Evening," the man called. "Looking for a runaway. Apache girl. You seen her?" His voice was casual, but Colt caught the sharpness underneath. Colt's jaw tightened. He shifted the rifle in his hands, his voice steady. "Ain't seen anyone come through here." The man studied him, his eyes narrowing. "Funny thing, her trail cut right toward this valley. You tell us if you'd seen her. Would save you trouble." Colt didn't move. His silence was heavy, the kind that warned more than words. The man spat into the dirt, then leaned forward on his saddle. "If she's here, she's ours. She ain't got no business being anywhere else." Colt's voice came low, cold. "If she was here, she'd be under my roof. And if she's under my roof, she stays." He lifted the rifle slightly, not aiming, but making his point. "You understand me?" The 3 men shifted uneasily. The tall one stared at Colt a long moment, then sneered. "Ain't worth the fight," he muttered to the others. With a tug of the reins, he turned his horse. The others followed, their voices fading as they rode off into the dusk. Colt stayed outside until the sound of hooves was gone, his rifle ready in his hands. When he finally turned back, Naeli stood in the doorway, watching him. Her face was pale, but her eyes were steady. He stepped toward her, lowering the rifle, and she whispered, "You protect me." He shook his head once, his voice low. "We protect each other." That night, the fire burned bright inside the cabin, the walls holding the warmth of more than just flame. Naeli sat close to Colt, her hand slipping into his without hesitation. For a long while, they said nothing. The silence no longer carried grief or fear. It carried choice. She had chosen to stay. He had chosen to keep her. As the fire dimmed, Naeli turned toward him, her eyes shining in the low light. "I live because of you," she said carefully, her words halting but sure. Colt's throat tightened, and he drew her close, kissing her softly, slowly, his hand steady at the back of her neck. She leaned into him, her body pressing against his, not in fear, but in trust. By the time they lay down together, the world outside no longer mattered. The cabin that had once been a tomb of his grief now held life again, her breath against his chest, her warmth against him, the steady rhythm of 2 hearts that had survived. In the days that followed, no riders came back. The ridge remained quiet. The danger had passed, at least for now, and with it came a peace Colt had thought he'd never know again. He and Naeli worked side by side, her strength returning each day. They spoke little, but their silence was no longer empty. It was shared, full, and alive. For Colt Warren, the consequence of pressing his mouth to hers by the river was not only her survival. It was his own return to life. Naeli had been reborn from the water, and in saving her, he had saved himself. Together, they had chosen to stay, and in that choice, they found what neither had believed possible: a family, a future, and a home.